What you're looking at here is our patio area from a distance. So if you were a bird flying in from the east, this is what you would view um, of our house and garden. The property itself is about an acre. Much of it's on an east-facing hillside. It's been a work in progress for the last 30 years, and I've learned a lot in that period of time. But before we get into that, I would like to go back a few years and sort of share a little bit of my history with you. Well, this is more than a few years, but I was born in a small mining town in Canada where the only access was by bush plane, with a runway being the local lake. And this is a picture of Lapa Cadillac mines in the 1940s. There were many lakes where we lived, but drinkable water wasn't easily accessible, and we got most of it from wells that were outside of the house. You could say that conserving water is in my DNA, as we followed a very specific water routine in our home. First and foremost, we used the water for drinking and food preparation. Once that was taken care of, we used the rest to bathe. First, my sisters and I would be put in the tub, and then my parents would use the same water, assuming it wasn't too funky. And after that, the bath water was used to mop the floor, so not a drop was wasted. And this is where I learned about water conservation. This image is more recent, but the plane in the picture is a Piper Clipper that dates back to the 1940s and is the type that would have been used to access the mining towns and their inhabitants in the 40s. That's my brother-in-law's treasured airplane, and he and my sister are hauling it up on a ramp in front of their cottage property outside of Ottawa, Canada. That plane is now used for recreation, fire spotting, and patrolling the lakes and rivers in the area of Ottawa for the Ottawa River Keepers. So although my time in the bush country is long gone, a lot of what I grew up with has stayed with me, and specifically my appreciation of nature and my attitude toward water conservation. Meeting my husband Dan in 1984 and moving into his home in the hills gave me the opportunity to develop the Gottlieb Garden, although I didn't start it until 1990, actually. This picture shows all the things that Dan and I love to do. When we first got together, one of our favorite activities was to get in the car and explore the back roads of Southern California. Visiting the California Poppy Reserve in the Antelope Valley was one of the highlights of the year, of course. Actually, this area where I'm standing in that picture is now all solar arrays. So it's the good and the bad, I guess. But even back then, it was increasingly clear that there was a huge amount of water waste in Southern California, and the environment was really suffering. We frequently drove by Owens and Mono Lakes and saw the devastation that was caused by the diversion of water for use in Los Angeles, much of which went to green lawns. I've always loved birds, but one of the things that really bothered me and still bothers me is the difficulty that migrating birds like these American avocets have finding water and areas to rest and feed during their long migrations. I felt that things needed to change, and I knew then that we would do our small part to help. And that's when the work on the garden began, and it began as a water conservation project. The first iteration in 1989 was a professional installation of 3 rock gardens that included cactus and succulents. And I had a landscape architect do that, and he actually did use some manzanita, which I didn't realize the importance of that at the time. The plant's origins then didn't matter to me since I knew nothing about gardening or native plants. The next step was to begin ivy removal. The hillsides were pretty much covered with ivy and other non-native species. Dan had a hard time understanding the concept of removing perfectly good ivy, and my rationale did not convince him. When I pointed out that the ivy provided excellent habitat for rats, but not much else, his comment was That's why they call that out there the outside, and this in here the inside. The rats live out there, and we live in here. Fortunately for me, but unfortunately for the rats, Dan indulged me, even though he thought he was living with a crazy woman who was destroying his landscaping. So this picture is one of the rock gardens that was put in 1989. My gardening knowledge was limited, so it seemed wise to proceed with ivy removal in sections. I didn't want a disaster such as losing the hillside during the rainy season. This picture of a bobcat was taken in the early days before we fully had removed the ivy. My initial plan was to get rid of the ivy, put in drought-tolerant plants, and then leave the garden to take care of itself. Maybe my garden would have a little bit of work. To give you a sense of the garden's transformation, here is the south-facing hillside before, and here it is after.
It's different.
This east-facing hillside was dominated by ivy, bougainvillea, and oleander before. And here's the same hillside after. All of these are native plants in here. The movement toward the use and conservation of California native plants has been led by an amazing array of individuals and groups, including the California Botanic Garden, the Theodore Payne Foundation, the National Wildlife Federation, the California Native Plant Society, and the National Audubon Society. While researching drought-tolerant plants, references to the term native plants kept popping up. The more I learned about the concept of using natives, the more the idea resonated. Some of you might think of cactus when you think of drought-tolerant California native plants. And yes, the beautiful prickly pear cactus is native and drought-tolerant, but it is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to California flora. And why use native plants, you ask? There are many reasons. First and foremost, they provide habitat for native wildlife. Second, they are a natural California heritage. The California poppy is the state flower. Third, they are absolutely beautiful. This is Grinnell's penstemon. And then on the right is the leopard lily, blue-eyed grass on the left, and fragrant pitcher sage on the right, woolly blue curls on the left, and bladderpod, which is not only beautiful, it's extremely drought tolerant, very popular with pollinators, and it's self-propagating. Most California native plants are drought tolerant, like this buckwheat. They are extremely functional and beautiful. This is foothill penstemon. With native plants, a garden can achieve beauty with purpose. Palo Verde trees, the blooms are simply magical and bumblebees love them. So many natives complement each other's beauty when grouped together. In this photo, starting from the left, is the jojoba. Then in the center is the California lilac, which is, this one is the Anchor Bay. Then on the right is coyote mint, Monardella villosa. The native animals will take advantage of almost all of them. This red monkey flower, for example, is a host for checker spot butterfly larvae. Some are simply too amazing to believe, like this giant, quote, fried egg, unquote, flower of the Matilaha poppy. And there are many types of grasses to choose from, like this purple threon. This California perennial grass produces colorful purple flowers and seed clusters and is simply gorgeous. In California, oak trees like this live oak are an important keystone species for both flora and fauna. Western honey mesquite is stunning in the early morning and late afternoon light. Many California natives are low maintenance, like this quail bush, Once native plants take root in the garden, they require very minimal upkeep compared to exotic non-natives. And so who doesn't love doing good for the world without a huge time commitment? Mountain mahogany shimmers when it's in seed. These trees can be very long-lived, with specimens existing in California that are over 1,000 years old. These feathery things that are on the mountain mahogany are actually the seeds, and they'll drop off, and they really take hold pretty well in my garden anyway. This is manzanita with its red bark. It's an iconic foothill plant. And when it's in bloom, the bell-shaped flowers are simply gorgeous and very popular with with bees, bumblebees especially. So many of these plants are beneficial to wildlife. This California fuchsia is a favorite food source for hummingbirds, and it has the added benefit of blooming in the late summer and early fall when there's not a lot of other plants in bloom. This female Allen's hummingbird is enjoying nectar from the tuberosa flowers. Few California natives offer as much food for wildlife as toyon. When in flower, it attracts a variety of insect pollinators. By late winter, ripe clusters of red berries attract a wide variety of birds, including cedar waxwings and American robins. Coast sunflower is a favorite of white-crowned sparrows. There are many species of California lilac that range from low-growing bushes to small trees. They produce abundant purple to white flowers that are beautiful, fragrant, and provide food for native wildlife. This one in the picture is a Ray Hartman. Like this black-tailed bumblebee, many flies, like this hoverfly on Apache plume, are great pollinators. Lilac verbena is wonderful for native pollinators and a perfect replacement for invasive non-native known as lantana. Although this looks like a bee, it's not a bee at all. It's actually a syrphid fly mimicking a bee. This picture was taken by Scott. These two are definitely bees. This purple sage flower attracted a female carpenter bee, who in turn caught the eye of a male carpenter bee, and who then decided to do what the birds and the bees do best. Another advantage to using native plants is that they don't require fertilizer and are very pest resistant. And if planting on a hillside, many plants produce long root systems like this coyote brush in the foreground, which helps to control soil erosion. Most of these plants we just looked at came from the Theodore Payne Foundation in Sun Valley. If you don't know this organization, you should get to know them. As anyone who cares about wildlife habitat will tell you, once you've discovered native plants, there's no turning back. I've gained much knowledge during many years of trial and error. And trust me, some of the errors were heartbreaking. This is a picture of a prized manzanita that was a favorite of native bumblebees. For some reason, all of the manzanitas in this variety in our yard have died off. Not knowing much about these plants, it seemed like a good idea to find a gardener who could help me implement my vision. I was incredibly lucky to meet Rogers Well and then Carlos Rokes, pictured here with his son Emerson. These men were instrumental in helping me create the Gottlieb Native Garden. And their work has been invaluable. As you can see in this photo, we do have some irrigation in the garden. It's mainly used for establishing new plants and during extreme hot spells. Also, from early on, I put name tags near the plants. Not only does this help me to remember what they are, but it also allows others exploring the garden to know what species of plant they're looking at. These plant stakes have a horrible habit of disappearing, though. In 2002, I met Frances Liao, the president of the board of the Theodore Payne Foundation. She had the idea to introduce a garden tour that showed the scope and beauty of native plants. And it was so exciting to have the Gottlieb Native Garden on the inaugural event. It didn't actually look quite this good at that time. Do you remember Hillhauser? In addition to his popular California's Gold, which aired on PBS, he also had a really great show called California's Green. And he did a feature on my garden. He visited the garden on the first day of the garden tour, the first Theodore Payne Foundation garden tour. And he ended up focusing on the Gottlieb Native Garden. Before the show, no one could figure out what the heck I was doing in the yard. But in his video, he'll explain my vision and help to put the idea of native plant gardening on the mainstream map. The Theodore Payne Garden Tour is now a very important annual event, and a typical weekend will have 30 to 40 gardens represented as opposed to the 8 it had in the first year. It's the one day of the year that the general public is allowed to roam the Gottlieb Native Garden, kind of somewhat unfettered. And every year, more and more people take advantage of it. Even little gardeners get to enjoy the action. We must start them young. As the interest in native gardening continues to grow, the attendance at the Theodore Payne Garden Tour has grown as well. We've had over 500 people visit the garden in one day. Guests are encouraged to explore the garden as long as they wish. Many will stay for hours, bird watching, sketching, taking photographs, or just simply relaxing. And of course, the garden's hummingbirds are always trying to steal the spotlight at any event. 6 years after the Theodore Payne tour began, the New York Times printed a story on the Gottlieb Native Garden, and I stopped having to explain myself. My work had finally been validated. When providing habitat for wildlife, water is very important. We have several water features in the garden. Some are simple, like this bath, which is basically a shallow depression and carved into a rock. Others are large and more elaborate, like this pond fed by a stream and a waterfall. My husband keeps fish in this pond, and egrets and herons prey on them from time to time, but that's okay, as we just consider it nature's tax. This particular bath, which is simply a cube with a thin layer of water flowing over the top of it, is very popular with many species of birds, like western tanagers and hummingbirds. A few years ago, we posted this video, and it went viral. Some of you may have seen it. It's called Hummingbird Pool Party Number 5. To our astonishment, it now has millions of views. It's wonderful that people from around the world are so interested in watching hummingbirds simply taking a bath. Not only do birds, like these band-tailed pigeons, take advantage of water features, but from time to time, these features support Baja California tree frogs. These frogs are tiny. Adults get to be about 1 to 2 inches, and they congregate in and around the water during mating season, early winter to early spring, during which time there's a lot of vocalizing. They can be incredibly loud. One season, a few of our little critters migrated to the neighbor's yard where their singing was so loud nobody was getting any sleep. We went right over there, rounded up those rascals, and brought them home with a good scolding. The number of frogs in our yard varies from season to season. Possibly the goldfish in the pond are eating the eggs and the tadpoles. While the garden was being built, I saw a hummingbird and decided to add a feeder. First 1, then 3, and now all these years later, there are between 10 and 15 30-ounce feeders out at all times. We go through 50 to 70 pounds of sugar a week. Word of Operation Hummingbird Feeder got out, and the BBC came a-knocking. They spent a day in the garden filming an episode called Beautiful Hummingbirds in Slow Motion. Dr. Lisa Tell, a veterinarian from UC Davis, heard about the hummingbird bounty and came with her team to band and tag birds for her research project on diseases in hummingbirds. At 6 years, it's the longest running university project hosted by the garden. Before they do any research on these tiny birds, they have to catch them in their ingenious trap. And after collecting all the vital statistics, they get banded. One final adjustment, and the bird is ready to let free. That's me with Dr. Tell releasing the bird. Equal exciting and gratifying are the wildlife sightings. My husband Dan photographed this juvenile great horned owl after it was spotted on the back hillside. And I was lucky to get a shot of this bobcat taking a breather after a failed attempt to catch a squirrel. Years ago, bobcats were spotted regularly in this garden, but in the last 10 to 12 years, those sightings have been less frequent. We suspect the culprit is rat poison. Top-end predators, cougars like P22, bobcats, coyotes, and birds of prey are all suffering the same fate. Death by rodenticide, aka rat poison. Fortunately, there are efforts underway to eliminate the use of these chemicals, and I urge you not to use them in your garden. Moving to a happier topic, I want to show you some of the extras that we have provided that help our wildlife. Mealworms are a very popular item, and California towhees can be little piggies when it comes to eating them. Orioles get their sugar water, and goldfinch. They do love that Niger seed feeder. Additionally, we provide homes for birds to raise their families in. Here are Lisa Fimiani and Rogers Weld installing a bluebird box in the lower garden. Wherever songbirds are found, you'll find Cooper's hawks. When Cooper's hawks are young and inexperienced, they do silly things like try to catch a bird by chasing it on foot. I watched this character chase goldfinches in and out of a hedge to no avail. Now that we've got the wildlife, we want to keep it safe from our cats and vice versa. So we provided the cats with a cat freeway. These trails started off simply enough, but now they loop around the yard and even up and over the roof. The cats even have access to a few outdoor catios. When I have spent so much time creating habitat for wildlife, I can rest easy knowing that the domestic and the wild are safe from each other. Oops. National Wildlife Federation has been an active proponent of gardening for wildlife and has a certification program that provides all the information necessary to create your own wildlife habitat. Many of you know this, but to reiterate, the most important things you need to garden for wildlife are food. Some of the native fruits and berries produced in the garden, like these Catalina cherries, are so delicious that we have to restrain ourselves so wildlife can get their fair share. Water. Wildlife will take advantage of almost any water source, even a decorative sculpture bath like this one. Cover. Cover means different things to different animals. Having multiple layers of foliage created by low-growing plants up to large bushes and trees is best. Lastly, places for wildlife to raise their young. The best and easiest nesting habitat you can add to your garden are nesting boxes. I am proud that the Gottlieb Native Garden has received the Backyard Habitat designation, and I'm also proud to have served on the President's Council of the NWF. I encourage any of you who are considering a conversion to a wildlife habitat garden to look at this organization. You can find all the information at nwf.org. I've spent 30 years working on the garden. Oops, I wanted to show you that. But it doesn't have to be such a monumental task. Or expensive. I've been lucky that Dan supports my passion and that we've had the resources to implement this vision. But please don't be intimidated by what I've done. Any budget, big or small, will work. Converting to a native garden doesn't have to be a bank breaker. For those on a tight budget, just a few native plants will still make a difference. You can create a native and drought-tolerant garden in your front yard or backyard. A small patio would even work, as would a balcony with only a few pots. All you need is to put your first California native plant in the soil and you'll be on your way. It's my hope that today you'll leave me feeling motivated to make a positive change by either considering a conversion to a native and drought-tolerant garden or by adding additional elements to attract wildlife. Thank you very much for letting me share my garden with you. And you'll find lots more information on our website, which is thegottliebnativegarden.com. And that's it. Thank you.
Oh, Susan, this was wonderful. You covered so much and made it seem like any of us could do it. I just love it. I hope we all have a lot of questions. Before we go to questions, I want to mention the fact that, is this showing okay on the screen? This is an actual copy of your book. And I'm sincerely hoping that people are going to stay because Susan has very generously provided 5 copies of this book for our drawing today. And at the end of question and answer, okay, I see I didn't start my video. I'm going to see. So beautiful book. Susan already showed the cover. A lot of the steps she covered are in this book, and the most magnificent photographs, many by her husband or by Scott Logan, who's also with us here today.
Actually, I'll correct you on that. Almost all the photographs are taken by me in that book. The next book, Scott Logan's book, is all his photographs. That's the second one.
Photographs in here. Oh, they're so beautiful. So this will happen this morning. Everybody stay tuned. But I think everybody also has questions. So
okay, fire away.
Questions. What I'd like you all to do, I've asked you to mute yourselves. If you have a question, unmute yourself. I think this is Lucia, right?
I was trying to unmute myself.
Unmute yourself, please, if you have a question.
Let me see, hold on.
Is there something in here? No.
Or raising your hands. If I see a hand raised, I'll call on you. All right, then I'm going to ask the first question.
All right.
Susan, you mentioned rat poison, and of course, we're not going to use rat poison. But what about other chemical herbicides, pesticides, things like that? Do you use any in your garden?
No, I don't use any of that. First of all, I don't really need them. The plants are pretty tough and they do withstand a lot of, and also if a plant does get a disease that I can't take care of with biological weapons or soaps or things, then it just, I just let it go. If it survives, it survives. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. So I did want to say one thing about the tour. We are doing tours again. Not the huge one like the Theodore Payne Foundation tour. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're
Okay.
connected.
So if any of your members wanted to tour the garden, we can set that up. We're just not doing the big Theodore Payne tour.
Oh, that would
Like, go ahead.
that would be amazing. We touring gardens is a huge part of what we like to do. So I think we're going to be knocking on your door.
Good, good. And just go on the website and talk to Diane, or you've talked to Diane already, and she has the schedule, so we can set that up.
Thank you very much. Have you all thought of the question you want to ask Susan or photographer Scott Gottlieb with her today? If you are, mute yourself and ask it, or raise your hand. I'm looking. Margaret, did you have a question?
Greg?
Did the elimination of the ivy eliminate the rats?
Well, yes, it did actually, but we do have native pack rats now. They're not a lot of them. Our biggest problem actually is ground squirrels, and that's a problem that we'd like to attract more hawks to take care of that problem, and bobcats and every other thing. I think this year they're not as bad. Do you think? And they're pretty plentiful, but I think the lack of water. We didn't actually get any acorns on our oak trees this year, and I think it's the drought probably. And I think maybe the wildlife does rely a lot on those acorns, and maybe the squirrels felt the lack. But I think they're not quite as plentiful this year.
What kind of problems do the squirrels cause? Is it mostly that they take the food away from others, or?
Well, but that's part of it, but they dig holes in the hillsides. They're just, gosh. And they've got fleas, I love the little guys, but there's too many of them.
Thank you.
Good there for them. Do you get hawks?
Oh, yeah. We have Cooper's hawks and red tails.
Red shoulder.
And red shoulders, yeah. So.
Ann White, I saw you raise your hand.
Yes, I'm just wondering, you showed us you have 2 gardeners, and I'm wondering, is it full-time for them to take care of it, or now that it's more mature garden, is it just a part-time effort?
Well, it would be part-time effort, but we're always finding other things to do. And one of the things we've been doing is, instead of weed whacking the hillsides for the fire department every year, we've been pulling the weeds out by hand, because that way we avoid cutting back the little volunteers that have come up in the hillsides, and we're not killing the lizards and snakes and things that get caught up in those weed whackers. So we're always finding things to do. We've helped the neighbors a bit. I've got a couple of houses across the street that we work on, just doing habitat over there. And with the pandemic, I just felt like these guys really needed the work, and so we've been spreading the word around the neighborhood.
You mentioned that they're doing some work. Your gardeners are extending into the neighbors' yards. Does that mean that your concept of providing habitat for wildlife is extending to the neighbors?
Well, they're all pretty interested,
Right.
and they love the whole concept. It's been interesting that not too many of them have actually put in native gardens, but I do see a few as I walk around the neighborhood now. That not necessarily the whole garden, but I just noticed the other day that one person has put Ceanothus Yankee Point on their front hillside, and that was so gratifying. But I do think that we have a tremendous amount of construction going on in our neighborhood, and all of the small, older houses that were built in the 60s are being replaced by the big behemoths, fill up the whole front. But, and they use a tremendous amount of landscaping material, and none of it is native. And to me, the big push now for us that are interested in using natives and promoting natives is to get a hold of these landscape architects who use, these houses after a month of completion look like they've been there for years because the landscaping is so full and mature looking. And it's because they've just spent gazillions of dollars buying mature plants, and all of it non-native. It would be just so easy to put in toyon as opposed to podocarpus, for example, and it would just make such a huge difference.
And that's kind of the point, I think, of your effort and your foundation's effort, is that each of us can make, even in a small way, a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah. A hummingbird will come to a plant in a pot if there's a red flower on it, and that's all it takes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unmute yourself if you have a question. Sandy?
Yes, just one little suggestion of where to start. Like, how can you just begin?
Oh, on the hillside, on our hillsides, I just took a small area and just pulled out the ivy and started putting in drought tolerant. And it couldn't have been more than, I don't know, how big would you say? I don't know, 10 yards by 10 yards, maybe. But first of all, you guys are gardeners, and so but I had no clue what I was doing when I started. So I had to be really careful, but that's how I just started really small. And you could start just by putting a plant in a pot too, for that matter, or a few plants in a few pots. But also, if you've got non-native drought tolerant plants, you could stick natives in there too. You don't have to make the conversion all at one time.
I completely agree with that. I think the thing is to begin. It's to, you don't have to have a huge plan. You don't have to hire an architect. You don't have to have $10,000 in the bank. It can be.
No, and the other thing, excuse me for interrupting, but while I'm thinking of it, or I'll forget, the Theodore Payne Foundation has now got a tremendous number of classes, beginners classes and design classes and irrigation class. They've got everything, and it's just so great. That's probably where I would start, is just to take a couple of their classes.
Excellent suggestion. Martha, you're nodding your head. Do you have a question?
I did. Well, I was just so struck by the beauty of this garden and your vision. And I wondered, what kind of gardener were you when you began this process? You spoke a little about it, but when I look at where you are now, wow, hokey smoke.
Well, I wasn't a gardener at all. We had a guy that came to the garden, the blow and go kind of guy. And when I got the idea to put in native or drought tolerant plants, he just sort of couldn't relate to it, actually. And so I started to look for somebody that would. And I asked somebody at the Theodore Payne Foundation, this was a long time ago, like 30 years ago. So they recommended a fellow by the name of Rogers Weld, and he was not into native plants so much as succulents and cactus. And at that time, people just thought native plants were pretty much succulents and cactus. And in his case, he thought that whatever was growing in the hillsides around his home in Topanga was native, but he was a real expert when it came to cactus and succulents. And so we just started learning together. And he had a very good eye for placing things. He knew a lot about gardening. He'd been in the gardening world for years. So that was really how I got into gardening. So I can't take any of the credit for the actual gardening myself. It was just, I would research the plants mostly, and we'd put them where we thought they should work. And it was really a lot of trial and error because there was very little information back then. There was a couple of little books. There was nothing. I don't think the internet existed did the internet exist in 1990? I don't think so.
Barely, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
not for the general public, at least. And even then, even if it was existing, there was nothing about native plants until much later. But now there's just tons of information on the online.
Yes, and it's something that I think we're all getting more information about. I mean, even Lowe's and Home Depot carry native plants, so-called.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we got some very good narrow leaf milkweed from Armstrong's. Yeah, a couple of years ago.
That's great.
And yeah, and I noticed that I think they have the Ceanothus Yankee Point in a lot of those places now.
Yes. So,
Kathy,
yes.
I have an additional comment. Thank you, Susan, so much. I was pleased to visit the garden some time ago with the CNPS, the Native Plant Society group. And your book certainly has sustained my my curiosity since then. I flip back to it and say, okay, now what did that look like? You know, but my suggestion at this point for everyone is also the California Botanic Garden, which is in Claremont. It used to be called Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, but it is a wonderful place to go to see plants that have absolutely been established, sometimes 20, 30, 40 years. So you will see what things are going to look like that far ahead in your garden. So as we all know, those beautiful little 4-inch containers and gallon containers look so cute, and you think you have to put in so many of them. But going to the garden there, you really can see how things are going to look at 5, 10 years. And also Theodore Payne in the last year has established quite a growing area that really is a demonstration area. It's not just the selling of the plants, but it is so that you can see what these plants are going to look like a year after you put them in and further ahead. So both of those places are really your excuse to go to when we can do more traveling again and really see what the plants are going to be prospectively looking like.
You know, mentioning the California Botanic Garden, we actually just published another book called California in a Vase. And it's all of the arrangements and we did it in conjunction with the California Botanic Garden. So that's the next thing.
And I'll just tell all of you here today, Susan Gottlieb, her Gottlieb Native Garden Foundation has donated 5 copies of that book as well. It will be the last presentation over this summer, where there's going to be 5 presentations beginning with this one concerning the Gottlieb Native Garden. And that California in a Vase book is just beautiful. So you'll want to be here for that in August. More questions, people, before we let Susan. Greg?
Kathy, there's a question in chat.
Oh, thank you.
What 5 plants would you recommend for the average small garden?
Well, buckwheat would be one. Gosh.
Toyon.
Well, if it's a small garden, but toyon for sure. But it's a fairly large shrub, and certainly the lilac verbena. Again, it's a small garden.
Milkweed?
Definitely milkweed. Thank you. Yeah, there's a big push now for that.
One more?
One more. Oh my God, the pressure. God, there's just so many. That's the problem. Oh, goodness.
Pitcher sage is beautiful and good pollinator.
What is?
The pitcher sage is so
Oh,
nice.
yeah. Well, any of the sages, any of the sages.
Yeah.
Yes.
But Scott was just mentioning the pitcher sage, which is very fast growing and really beautiful. But God, there's so many of them.
Is
Mhm.
that the one, Scott or Susan, that we also call hummingbird sage?
No,
No?
no, that's a different sage, but that's another beautiful. It's called Lepicinia fragrans is the pitcher sage, but the hummingbird sage is Salvia spathacea.
But that one takes more shade.
It does.
That's right. So that's a starting point. I'm glad there's interest. Any other questions?
Oh, I have another suggestion that just occurred to me. Calscape. Susan, you may know what the exact URL is. Calscape.org, maybe?
Oh, yeah, that's CNPS, right?
Yeah, you put in your zip code and it comes up with, 50 or 100 or 2 or whatever number of plants that are specific to your garden, literally your zip code. And you can do all sorts of filters like just drought tolerant or just yellow or whatever qualities about the plant you want. So it makes it a lot less mysterious just asking somebody, what can I plant in my garden? Because here it's all
good
beautiful
suggestion.
pictures and everything there. So it's Calscape, I think, .org.
If you just put Calscape in, it'll come up.
Right.
But that's a great suggestion. Thank you for saying that, because I think the Audubon Society is doing the same thing, same kind of thing. I think they're focused a little bit on what birds. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, they're very focused on the wildlife aspect of it. So I would do both. They've come a long way with that.
If you just begin, if you begin your one plant or your 5 plants, they automatically attract wildlife. It's almost like a miracle.
It is. It absolutely is. Yeah, right in the middle of the city. I mean, we did a very small garden for a friend, and like immediately she had hummingbirds in the garden because we put in, the right plants for that. Yeah. So, but thank you, everybody. It was a lovely morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your being here today. I think the next thing we're going to do is draw names